When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Stasi archives revealed something extraordinary. Among the thousands of classified documents, researchers discovered a peculiar gap in the records. Border crossing logs from Checkpoint Charlie between 1963 and 1989 were missing, not destroyed, but never recorded. For 26 years, certain passages across the most heavily guarded border in the world had somehow remained invisible to East German intelligence. 30 years later, a former CIA operative finally revealed the truth: there was someone on the inside. We never knew his name, but he saved more lives than any official operation ever could. This is the story of the man they called Angel. Welcome to Silent Legends. Before we journey back to the divided city of Berlin during the Cold War's darkest days, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe legends like Sergeant Müller deserve to be remembered, subscribe to witness stories that time forgot, but history never will. The concrete barrier stretched like a scar across Berlin, dividing not just a city but an entire world. Border Guard Sergeant Klaus Müller began his shift at 1800 hours every evening, his pale blue eyes scanning the death strip that separated east from west. At 42, he was unremarkable to his fellow guards: competent, reliable, utterly predictable. Müller's sector was a 200-meter stretch near Checkpoint Charlie, one of the most sensitive areas of the entire border. Concrete barriers stood nearly 4 meters high, topped with barbed wire and flanked by watchtowers. Floodlights illuminated every centimeter of the death strip, where even weeds seemed afraid to grow out of line. To anyone observing the Müller family, they appeared to be model East German citizens. Klaus served dutifully at the border, his wife Ingrid worked as a state secretary, and their son Peter studied engineering at Humboldt University. They lived quietly in a gray apartment building, loyal to the state that provided their modest but secure life. What neither Ingrid nor Peter knew was that Klaus Müller had been recruited by American intelligence in 1963. A Swiss businessman had approached him carefully, spending months building trust before revealing his purpose. He offered Müller something no amount of propaganda could provide: the knowledge that his service could actually save lives rather than simply preventing escapes. Müller's mission was to create humanitarian corridors, brief windows when the most heavily guarded border in the world would become, for just 7 minutes, passable. Once or twice a month, he received coded messages through innocent conversations at his local pub, indicating when refugees would attempt crossing his sector. Creating these failures required extraordinary skill. Müller learned to disable motion sensors through electrical shorts that appeared accidental, redirect searchlights by loosening mounting bolts, and time patrol routes to create gaps in observation. Each operation required perfect timing, complete secrecy, and nerves of steel. The psychological challenge was crushing. Each day, Müller stood watch over a border designed to imprison his own people while secretly creating holes in that prison. He attended Communist Party meetings, nodded at speeches about capitalist threats, knowing he was actively assisting that same threat. By 1975, 12 years into his mission, Müller had facilitated 47 successful crossings. But the constant deception and knowledge that one mistake could mean execution were taking their toll. The mission that would ultimately expose his dual life began with a request unlike any he had received before. The message came through Hans, the elderly newspaper vendor at the S-Bahn station, who mentioned his Swiss nephew had asked about weather conditions. When Müller decoded the information, he realized this operation would be different. 12 East German scientists needed extraction, their knowledge of classified nuclear research making them high-priority targets for Western intelligence. Creating a window for 12 people required extensive security breakdowns. Müller would need simultaneous failures across multiple systems while maintaining plausible explanations. The technical challenge was unprecedented, and the investigation that would follow could expose his entire 24-year operation. The night of February 15, 1987, brought heavy snow that complicated Müller's planning. Natural weather interference could trigger sensor malfunctions that would appear too convenient if they coincided with his planned failures. At 0215 hours, he began implementing the most complex sabotage of his career. He created a cascade failure beginning with motion sensors, spreading to searchlight controls, and temporarily disrupting radio communications. For 12 minutes, a 300-meter section of the Berlin Wall's defenses were effectively blind. The scientists moved through in 3 waves, guided by CIA operatives to extraction points in West Berlin. But routine patrol discovered footprints in the snow, evidence that multiple people had crossed during the system failures. Within hours, Stasi investigators cordoned off the sector and began reviewing all security incidents involving Müller's shifts over 5 years. Major Wilhelm Krantz, leading the investigation, was methodical. Reviewing 24 years of records, he discovered subtle patterns. Equipment failures in Müller's sector correlated with lunar cycles, weather conditions, and shift schedules in ways suggesting careful planning rather than random malfunction. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Krantz realized he was looking at someone who had systematically created humanitarian corridors through the Berlin Wall for over 2 decades, potentially hundreds of successful crossings that had never been detected because they had never officially occurred. The surveillance began subtly, in ways that Müller might not have noticed if he hadn't spent decades observing and evading detection himself. Stasi agents posed as maintenance workers, conducting unusually thorough inspections of equipment in his sector. Fellow guards asked casual questions about his technical knowledge and his theories about the recent equipment failures. Even Ingrid mentioned that a colleague had inquired about Klaus's background and military service record. Müller realized that his situation had become critical when he noticed the same face in 3 different locations over 2 days, a young man in civilian clothes who appeared to be shopping, waiting for buses, and visiting the same pub where Müller sometimes received coded messages. The surveillance was professional but not invisible to someone trained to recognize it. The decision to run came when Müller discovered that his duty locker had been searched. The search was skillful, but after 24 years of maintaining false identities and hidden equipment, Müller could detect the subtle signs that someone had examined his possessions. They were still gathering evidence, but the investigation was approaching its conclusion. Müller's escape plan had been prepared years earlier, but activating it meant abandoning everything: his family, his identity, and his mission. The CIA had provided extraction protocols that could get him to West Berlin within hours, but using them would confirm Stasi suspicions and potentially expose the entire network that had supported his operations. More painfully, fleeing would leave Ingrid and Peter to face the consequences of his betrayal. In East Germany, the families of defectors were considered guilty by association, facing imprisonment, loss of employment, and social exile. Müller's escape would destroy the lives of the 2 people he loved most, but staying would certainly result in his execution and possibly theirs as well. The extraction began at 0340 hours on March 7, 1987, during Müller's regular shift at the wall. He used his final planned equipment malfunction to create a window for his own crossing, disabling the same systems he had sabotaged dozens of times to help refugees reach freedom. The irony was not lost on him that his last act as a border guard was to escape across the border he had spent 24 years pretending to defend. But Müller's crossing was different from the refugee operations he had facilitated. He carried with him a lifetime of classified knowledge about East German border security, surveillance systems, and operational procedures. His defection would provide Western intelligence with unprecedented insight into Warsaw Pact border controls and potentially compromise operations throughout Eastern Europe. The CIA safe house in West Berlin was a modest apartment in the American sector, indistinguishable from the hundreds of similar buildings that housed refugees, students, and workers. Müller was debriefed by a team of specialists who had been studying his reports for years but had never expected to meet him face to face. They knew him only as Angel, the mysterious source who had facilitated more humanitarian crossings than any other single operation in Cold War history. The debriefing revealed the full scope of what Müller had accomplished. Over 24 years, he had facilitated 127 successful border crossings, helping refugees that included families, intellectuals, political dissidents, and ultimately the 12 scientists whose extraction had triggered his exposure. Each operation had required individual planning and adaptation, and none had ever been detected by East German authorities. But the human cost of Müller's mission was becoming clear as well. Within days of his defection, Ingrid had been arrested and interrogated about her knowledge of his activities. Peter had been expelled from university and faced a lifetime of suspicion and limited opportunities. The Stasi had also arrested dozens of people who had been tangentially connected to refugee crossings, casting a wide net in their effort to understand the full extent of the intelligence breach. The investigation into Müller's activities revealed that the missing records from Checkpoint Charlie were just the beginning. Stasi analysts discovered that equipment failure patterns suggested similar operations at multiple border crossings, implying a network of agents that had been systematically undermining East German border security for decades. The revelation prompted a massive security review that ultimately exposed vulnerabilities throughout the Warsaw Pact. Müller's debriefing also provided Western intelligence with detailed information about Stasi operational procedures, surveillance techniques, and the psychological methods used to control East German society. His 24 years inside the system had given him unique insights into how authoritarian governments maintained control and how that control could be systematically undermined. But perhaps the most significant revelation was the extent to which individual acts of conscience could affect the course of history. Müller's decision to help refugees cross the Berlin Wall had been motivated by humanitarian concerns rather than political ideology. He had not been trying to bring down the East German government or win the Cold War. He had simply been trying to reunite families and help people escape oppression. The ripple effects of his actions had extended far beyond the 127 people he had directly helped. Many of the refugees he had assisted had gone on to build new lives in the West, contributing to science, education, and culture in ways that enriched democratic societies. Some had become advocates for human rights, using their experiences to help others escape totalitarian systems. The 12 scientists whose extraction had triggered his exposure had provided intelligence that advanced Western understanding of Soviet military capabilities. As Müller settled into his new life in West Berlin, he learned that his story had become legendary within intelligence circles, though his identity remained classified. The name Angel had become synonymous with the possibility of individual courage in the face of overwhelming systemic oppression. His methods had been studied and adapted for use in other situations, helping refugees from various authoritarian regimes around the world. But the personal cost remained overwhelming. Müller had saved 127 strangers while destroying the lives of his wife and son. The letters he wrote to Ingrid were returned unopened, and attempts to contact Peter through intermediaries were unsuccessful. The family he had loved and protected had become victims of the same system he had fought against, and there was no way to repair the damage his choices had caused. The paradox of Müller's situation reflected the broader moral complexities of the Cold War. His humanitarian work had required him to betray his official duties, lie to his family, and ultimately abandon them to face consequences he could not prevent. The good he had accomplished was real and measurable, but so was the harm he had caused to the people closest to him. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall finally fell, Müller watched the celebrations from his apartment in West Berlin, knowing that his small part in undermining the barrier had contributed to its eventual collapse. But he also knew that somewhere in the crowd of reunited families and celebrating citizens, Ingrid and Peter might be among those who would never forgive him for the choices he had made. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, transformed Klaus Müller from a protected CIA asset into a man whose past could finally be acknowledged. As East German archives were opened and Stasi files became available to researchers, the full scope of Operation Angel began to emerge. Intelligence historians studying Cold War espionage discovered that Müller's 24-year mission represented one of the longest and most successful infiltration operations in history. The Stasi files revealed how close Major Krantz had come to exposing Müller before his defection. Investigators had identified him as the probable source of security breaches, but they had underestimated the sophistication of his methods and the length of time he had been operating. The investigation had been proceeding methodically toward his arrest when his sudden disappearance confirmed their suspicions while denying them the opportunity to understand how he had evaded detection for so long. More significantly, the files documented the extent of Müller's humanitarian work. Stasi records included incident reports for dozens of equipment failures that had never been fully explained, refugee apprehension statistics that showed unexplained gaps in border security effectiveness, and investigative reports that had failed to identify patterns that now seemed obvious in retrospect. The revelation of Müller's identity created a complex situation for both German governments. East German authorities who had spent years searching for the mysterious angel suddenly had a name and face to attach to decades of unsolved security breaches. West German and American intelligence agencies found themselves dealing with an operative whose cover had been blown by historical events rather than operational failures. But the most significant consequence of the wall's fall was the possibility of reuniting Müller with his family. Ingrid and Peter had survived the investigation that followed his defection, though their lives had been permanently altered by suspicion and harassment. They had been relocated to a smaller city, given menial jobs, and subjected to constant surveillance that made normal relationships impossible. The first contact came through the International Red Cross, which had been facilitating family reunification since the wall's opening. Ingrid received a letter from Klaus explaining his 24 years of secret work and the circumstances that had forced him to flee. The letter was accompanied by official documentation from American intelligence confirming his status as a humanitarian operative rather than a traditional spy. Peter's reaction was more complex. At 28, he had spent his entire adult life dealing with the consequences of his father's betrayal without understanding its context. Learning that Klaus had been working to help refugees rather than serving Western military interests provided some explanation for his actions, but it didn't erase years of suffering or restore the opportunities that had been lost. The reunion, when it finally occurred in early 1990, was emotionally devastating for all involved. Müller faced his wife and son knowing that his choices had destroyed their lives in East Germany while potentially saving the lives of 127 strangers. Ingrid struggled with the revelation that her husband's disappearance had been motivated by conscience rather than cowardice or betrayal. Peter confronted the reality that his father had been simultaneously a hero and the person whose actions had ruined his young life. The conversation that followed lasted 3 days and resolved nothing completely. Müller could not undo the consequences of his choices, and his family could not simply forgive the years of deception and abandonment. But slowly, painfully, they began to understand the impossible situation Klaus had faced and the moral framework that had driven his decisions. The process of rebuilding their relationship was complicated by the attention Müller's story began receiving as Cold War histories were written and classified operations were declassified. The man who had spent 24 years in absolute secrecy found himself being interviewed by journalists, historians, and documentary filmmakers who wanted to understand how he had managed to operate undetected for so long. Müller's technical methods became the subject of academic study in intelligence schools and security training programs. His techniques for creating plausible equipment failures were analyzed and incorporated into training curricula for operations in other authoritarian societies. His psychological strategies for maintaining cover identities while conducting subversive activities influenced programs for training deep cover operatives. But the broader significance of Müller's story lay in its demonstration that individual conscience could effectively resist systemic oppression. His operations had not been directed from Washington or coordinated with major strategic initiatives. They had been the product of one man's decision to use his position to help people escape tyranny, regardless of personal risk or political consequences. The refugees Müller had helped began coming forward as his identity became public. Many had built successful lives in the West and wanted to thank the man who had made their freedom possible. Their stories provided concrete evidence of the impact individual courage could have on the course of history. Among those who contacted Müller was Dr. Elizabeth Weber, one of the nuclear physicists whose extraction had triggered the investigation that exposed him. She had gone on to work for the International Atomic Energy Agency, using her expertise to prevent nuclear proliferation. Her escape had been motivated by knowledge of a secret weapons program that her information had helped Western intelligence agencies monitor and ultimately prevent. Another was the Richter family, the teacher, his wife, and 2 children who had been Müller's first successful operation in 1963. The children had grown up to become prominent advocates for human rights, using their experiences to help other refugees from various authoritarian regimes around the world. Their escape had been the beginning of a lifetime of service to humanitarian causes. Each story reinforced the same fundamental truth: Müller's individual acts of conscience had created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate rescue of 127 people. His humanitarian work had contributed to scientific advances, human rights advocacy, and ultimately the broader struggle for freedom that had led to the wall's collapse. In 1992, 3 years after reunification, Müller was invited to speak at the dedication of a memorial to victims of the Berlin Wall. Standing in front of the site where he had spent 24 years pretending to prevent escapes while secretly facilitating them, he addressed an audience that included former refugees, intelligence officials, and historians. His speech was brief and focused on the individuals rather than the politics involved in his work. He spoke about the families he had helped reunite, the scientists whose knowledge had been preserved for democratic societies, and the ordinary people who had simply wanted to live free from oppression. He did not portray himself as a hero but as someone who had been in a position to help and had chosen to do so. The memorial service was attended by Ingrid and Peter, marking the first time the family had appeared together in public since the reunification. Their presence was a powerful symbol of the personal costs involved in resistance work and the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds caused by impossible choices. Klaus Müller's later years were spent quietly in a reunified Berlin, working as a consultant for organizations involved in refugee assistance and human rights advocacy. His expertise in border security and clandestine operations proved valuable for groups helping people escape from various authoritarian regimes around the world. The skills he had developed during 24 years at the Berlin Wall found new applications in humanitarian work that didn't require deception or abandonment of family. The relationship with Ingrid and Peter evolved slowly, marked by progress and setbacks that reflected the complexity of their shared trauma. Ingrid eventually came to understand that Klaus's choices had been motivated by principles she could respect, even if she couldn't forgive the personal costs they had entailed. Peter struggled longer with the consequences of his father's decisions, but gradually developed appreciation for the moral courage involved in risking everything to help strangers. The family dynamics were further complicated by the discovery of letters Klaus had written to them during his years in hiding but had never sent. The letters revealed the emotional toll his mission had taken and his constant awareness of what his choices were costing the people he loved most. Reading these documents helped Ingrid and Peter understand that Klaus had not abandoned them lightly or without consideration of their suffering. In 1995, the CIA officially declassified Operation Angel, acknowledging Müller's contribution to Cold War intelligence work while emphasizing the humanitarian nature of his mission. The declassification revealed that his work had been considered so valuable that the agency had considered it one of their most successful long-term operations, despite the fact that it had been motivated by conscience rather than national interest. The academic study of Müller's methods led to significant changes in how intelligence agencies approached long-term infiltration operations. His techniques for maintaining cover identities while conducting subversive activities became standard training material, and his psychological strategies for dealing with the stress of extended deception influenced programs for preparing deep cover operatives. But perhaps more importantly, his story became part of the broader narrative about individual resistance to authoritarianism. Universities teaching courses on human rights, political science, and modern history used his case as an example of how single individuals could effectively challenge oppressive systems through sustained acts of conscience. The refugees Müller had helped became a network of advocates for other victims of political oppression. Many maintained contact with him, and their children grew up hearing stories about the mysterious border guard who had risked everything to help their families escape. This network eventually evolved into a formal organization providing assistance to refugees from various countries, carrying forward the humanitarian principles that had motivated Müller's original mission. Dr. Elizabeth Weber, the nuclear physicist whose extraction had triggered Müller's exposure, became one of his closest collaborators in this work. Her scientific expertise combined with his operational experience to create programs helping intellectuals and professionals escape from countries where their knowledge or political views put them at risk. The Richter family, Müller's first successful operation, established a foundation providing educational scholarships for refugee children. Their own children's success in democratic societies had convinced them that education was the most effective way to help refugees build new lives and contribute to their adopted countries. In 2003, 14 years after the wall's fall, Müller was diagnosed with cancer, likely caused by decades of exposure to industrial chemicals and radiation from the surveillance equipment he had regularly sabotaged. The diagnosis prompted a final project, the compilation of a detailed memoir documenting his methods and motivations for future generations of humanitarian workers. The memoir, published posthumously in 2007, provided unprecedented insight into the psychological and technical aspects of long-term resistance operations. But its most powerful sections dealt with the moral complexities of choosing between official duty and personal conscience, between family loyalty and humanitarian obligation. Müller's funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had directly or indirectly affected. Former refugees came from across Europe and North America to pay respects to the man who had made their freedom possible. Intelligence officers who had studied his methods attended alongside human rights advocates who had been inspired by his example. Ingrid and Peter delivered the eulogy, speaking about Klaus not as a legendary operative or historical figure, but as a husband and father who had faced impossible choices and tried to live according to his deepest convictions. Their words emphasized the personal costs of his decisions while acknowledging the significance of his humanitarian work. The memorial service was followed by the establishment of the Angel Foundation, an organization providing assistance to refugees and supporting research into nonviolent resistance to authoritarian governments. The foundation's work carried forward Müller's commitment to helping individuals escape oppression while studying the most effective methods for resisting tyranny. Today, a section of the former Berlin Wall near Checkpoint Charlie bears a small plaque commemorating the unknown individuals who risked everything to help others find freedom. While Müller's name doesn't appear on the memorial, those familiar with his story understand that it represents his legacy and that of countless others who chose conscience over convenience. The site has become a place of pilgrimage for refugees, human rights advocates, and anyone interested in understanding how individual courage can challenge systemic oppression. Visitors often leave flowers or small stones, continuing an informal tradition that began shortly after Müller's death. The lessons of Klaus Müller's story continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about moral responsibility, individual agency, and the possibility of resistance within oppressive systems. His methods have been studied and adapted for use in various humanitarian contexts, while his example provides inspiration for anyone facing conflicts between official duty and personal conscience. Perhaps most importantly, his story demonstrates that some of history's most significant achievements come from people who never sought recognition or fame, but simply tried to help others when they had the opportunity to do so. The 127 refugees he helped cross the Berlin Wall were just the beginning of his impact. The true measure of his legacy lies in the thousands of lives that have been improved by the work of those he inspired. The concrete sections of the Berlin Wall that remain standing today serve as reminders of a divided world that seems almost unimaginable to younger generations. But for those who lived through the Cold War, these fragments represent more than historical artifacts. They are monuments to the power of individual conscience to challenge seemingly permanent systems of oppression. Klaus Müller's story is carved into the history of those concrete barriers, though his name appears in no official records and his face is shown in no museum displays. For 24 years, he stood guard over a wall designed to imprison his own people, while secretly creating holes in that prison that allowed 127 individuals to escape to freedom. The mathematics of his achievement are staggering: 127 successful crossings over 24 years of operation, each requiring weeks of planning and split-second execution, all conducted under the constant threat of discovery and execution. But the true significance of his work cannot be measured in numbers alone. Each person Müller helped escape carried with them the potential for contributions to science, art, education, and human understanding that enriched democratic societies. Dr. Elizabeth Weber's work in nuclear nonproliferation potentially prevented conflicts that could have cost millions of lives. The Richter Children's advocacy for human rights helped establish legal frameworks that protect refugees worldwide. Dozens of other refugees became teachers, engineers, doctors, and artists whose work created value that extended far beyond their personal liberation. But perhaps Müller's most important legacy lies in demonstrating that resistance to tyranny doesn't require grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. His most effective weapon against authoritarianism was patience, the willingness to spend decades in careful, methodical work that saved lives one family at a time. His greatest act of rebellion was simply choosing to help when he had the opportunity to do so. The wall that once divided Berlin has been gone for over 3 decades, but barriers to human freedom continue to exist around the world. In countries where borders are militarized, where surveillance technology monitors every movement, and where authoritarian governments control their people through fear, Klaus Müller's example provides a template for resistance that doesn't require violence or revolution. His story reminds us that some of the most important battles for human freedom are fought not by armies or governments, but by individuals who choose conscience over convenience, courage over conformity. The border guard who creates a brief malfunction in surveillance equipment, the bureaucrat who loses a deportation order, the security officer who looks the other way at the crucial moment, these small acts of defiance can accumulate into movements that change history. Today, as new walls are built and old barriers are reinforced, the memory of Klaus Müller and the 127 people he helped escape serves as a reminder that no system of oppression is impermeable to human compassion. Every authoritarian regime depends on the cooperation of ordinary people in ordinary jobs, and every such person faces the same choice Müller confronted: whether to serve the system faithfully or to quietly subvert it in service of higher principles. The lessons of Operation Angel extend beyond the specific circumstances of Cold War Berlin. In refugee camps around the world, in countries where political dissidents face imprisonment, in situations where families are separated by conflict or persecution, there are people in positions to help who must decide whether to act on their conscience or maintain their comfortable complicity. Klaus Müller's legacy challenges each of us to consider what we would do if faced with similar choices. Would we risk our careers, our families, our lives to help strangers escape oppression? Would we have the patience to maintain a facade for decades while secretly working to undermine injustice? Would we choose the harder path of active resistance over the easier path of passive compliance? The answers to these questions matter because the conditions that created the Berlin Wall, fear, nationalism, the desire to control human movement, continue to exist. New walls are being built, new surveillance technologies are being deployed, and new forms of authoritarianism are emerging that require new forms of resistance. But Müller's story also provides hope. It demonstrates that individual conscience can be more powerful than state coercion, that patient resistance can outlast even the most oppressive systems, and that the decision to help others can create ripple effects that extend far beyond what any single person can imagine. In the end, Klaus Müller was neither a professional spy nor a political revolutionary. He was a border guard who decided that his uniform didn't define his moral obligations, that his official duties couldn't override his human responsibility to help people in need. His 24 years of secret service remind us that heroism often wears the most ordinary disguises and that the most important victories are often the ones that nobody witnesses. The wall fell in 1989, but the angel's work continues wherever people choose to help rather than harm, to include rather than exclude, to build bridges rather than barriers. His legacy lives on not in monuments or museums, but in the actions of countless individuals who choose conscience over convenience, one person at a time. Have you ever been in a position where you could help someone escape injustice or oppression? Have you known someone who quietly resisted authority to help others? Share their story in the comments below. Thank you for watching Silent Legends. If this story moved you, subscribe and help us honor those who were never meant to be forgotten but whose courage deserves to be remembered.